expert in international relations and security, Sossi Thatikian, will be doing an interview with the Public TV tonight. Mrs. Thatikian, thank you for accepting the invitation.
Thank you very much for inviting.
After 10 months of blockade and a military aggression, more than 100,000 Armenians were forced out of Nagorno-Karabakh, lost their homes and loved ones. Russian peacekeepers, the international community, international organizations failed to prevent ethnic cleansing. Why?
I think that we should distinguish Russian peacekeepers and the rest of international community, meaning the European Union, the United Nations and US. Because Russian peacekeepers, I guess, not only didn't prevent it, but even contributed to it. I believe that it was even coordinated with them, and they intentionally didn't take action to prevent the military operation. And most likely, Azerbaijan had a green light from Russia. Otherwise, I don't think that it would dare to launch this military aggression in Nagorno-Karabakh. It reminds a little bit how Dutch peacekeepers couldn't prevent the massacre in Srebrenica. By the way, if you watch any documentary about Srebrenica massacre, you will see that Azerbaijan has implemented the same scenario step by step, except the last act. Because Srebrenica had the same scenario. It was a blockade, which eventually turned into a total siege and starvation. Afterwards, the Serbian forces entered Srebrenica with a military action, and they convinced the local armed forces to disarm. And afterwards, there was a massacre of men, which was not prevented by the Russian peacekeepers, and a mass exodus of the civil population. So here Azerbaijan conducted exactly the same scenario. Even the language used is similar, because the other one in Srebrenica was also called anti-terror operation. And there was one more similarity, that after Mladic forces entered the Srebrenica, they started convincing the local population that you are not threatened, you are safe, you will receive food, you will receive economic benefits. So it was really, really similar. And I think the reason that at least the last tragic act, which was a detention of men and possibly their killing, wasn't implemented fully. It was only the pressure by the international community, namely by the US and European Union. And however, it doesn't justify the whole military operation, because it was obvious that it wasn't targeting only the armed forces. Many civilians also were murdered, and now, as we know from human rights defenders, there are mutilations and signs of tortures on the bodies of the corpse, including those of women and children. The reason why international community didn't prevent it was that they were applying this policy of liberal peace with an illiberal, autocratic, totalitarian, militaristic country. And this soft diplomacy didn't really work with Azerbaijan, because Azerbaijan increasingly started blackmailing not only Armenia, but even international actors who were supportive of Armenians and Armenia. Another reason is that in light of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, this notion of territorial integrity in international law became absolute. It was never absolute before, because there are two equal principles in international law: territorial integrity and self-determination. And in the beginning of this century, actually, self-determination was very important. And as we know, Kosovo and South Sudan, in similar scenarios as Nagorno-Karabakh, received remedial secession, and Timor-Leste, annexed by Indonesia, received restoration of independence. However, this scenario could not be applied to Nagorno-Karabakh because the times were very unfortunate. But, you know, I can still understand why this remedial scenario, independent scenario, could not be applied to Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020 or 2023. However, I still cannot accept the fact that after Prime Minister Pashinyan announced about lowering the bar, even autonomy was not imposed on Azerbaijan, because lowering the bar did not mean abolishing any status for people who have been living in that area, and they are indigenous to that area for 3,000 years, and they have always had self-governance, starting medieval ages, kingdoms, etc., etc. So even during the Soviet period, they had an autonomy. And abolishing autonomy was contradictory to international law, and I'm convinced that it was a mistake by international community, whoever it is, the European Union, the US, Russia, not to pressure Azerbaijan to accept autonomous status for Nagorno-Karabakh, because that would be one of the only security and human rights guarantees for Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. The other one would be international mission, and there were two options for this mission: either United Nations peacekeeping mission or European Union Common Defense and Security Policy mission. And both became impossible due to the crisis in UN Security Council, polarization, geopolitical interests of the actors, as well as the absolute rejection by Azerbaijan and the presence of Russian peacekeepers there. But international community had to pressure Azerbaijan to accept international peacekeepers, and they had to find a way to bypass those geopolitical interests in order to not to violate responsibility to protect and leave no one behind principles. So all of this became irrelevant, and of course we know that this is not about Nagorno-Karabakh. International law, Security Council, and the whole global liberal governance system in general is in crisis. So Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is not the only conflict that became a victim of this collateral damage of this geopolitical polarization, and it's very unfortunate.
So it's not realistic, if I got you right, that the international community might reverse the ethnic cleansing of Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh?
I do believe that it is possible in case of political will. But I just think that the way it's handled at the moment is too little, and it's not going to lead to reversal of ethnic cleansing. In order to reverse ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh, which should happen, because otherwise ethnic cleansing in the European neighborhood in 2023 is shameful. It's shameful for international community. It's shameful for international global governance system. In order to reverse it, there should be several preconditions imposed on Azerbaijan. And of course, international global actors should impose those preconditions, namely the European Union and US. And those preconditions, as I said, some kind of autonomous status, self-governance institutions, because it's a norm in international practice that if there is an ethnic entity that has suffered human rights abuses, oppression for a lengthy period of time, either there are two ways. Either this entity is granted remedial succession, which we know is incredibly difficult and unrealistic in the current geopolitical circumstances, or they receive some kind of autonomous status. And this autonomous status happens even in the Western Europe. We know that there are plenty of entities in Western European countries that have various levels of special autonomous status. Look at Scotland, look at Northern Ireland, look at New Caledonia, Corsica in France. There are a lot, like Catalonia or Basque Country. They all have different kinds of self-governance within the parent state. And finally, the international peacekeeping or if it's not the UN, EU Common Defense and Security Policy mission, because without any international mission, it's impossible to have security guarantees for Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, so any return would be impossible. And of course, the demilitarization.
The international organizations did not deploy an international peacekeeping mission in Nagorno-Karabakh, even when the Armenians were living there. How likely is it that they will do it now that they have left their homes, that they were forcibly deported?
That's a very good question, of course. I know that it sounds very unrealistic, but then international community should be at least honest and not to urge Azerbaijan to ensure the right of return and not to urge Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh to return. Because without those guarantees, and the third guarantee I was going to talk about is demilitarization. Now you have Azerbaijani armed forces everywhere in Nagorno-Karabakh, including Stepanakert. You have all those symbols, Azerbaijani flags at every step. You have the statue of Iron Fist by Azerbaijan. So Azerbaijan is doing everything to assert its hegemony and dominance in a very militaristic way. And to expect that Armenians may return in those circumstances, that's unrealistic and that's not honest. So if the international community accepts that there has been ethnic cleansing without being prevented in the European neighborhood in 1923 and condemns it and imposes sanctions for it, because there cannot be impunity for ethnic cleansing in 2023.
Despite Azerbaijan's obvious failure to comply with international commitments, the most recent one being promised reintegration of Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians, which was actually replaced with ethnic cleansing, there are no sanctions against Baku. Why?
Because of the reasons that I mentioned, that international community thought that this soft diplomacy is going to work with Azerbaijan, because Azerbaijan
But now they know that they miscalculated.
True.
How about now?
True, and that's exactly why they should impose those preconditions that they haven't imposed before the ethnic cleansing was committed. That's exactly the logic, because now they see that Azerbaijan was not genuine in its so-called integration agenda, which to me was obvious since the very first day that it was actually an agenda of subjugation and eventually ethnic cleansing. And we experts could see that it was going to happen, and we were warning about it to international actors. So now they know, now they saw it by their own eyes. And I do understand that it's very unrealistic to reverse this process. I mean, it's not unrealistic, but if there is a political will. But if there is a political will, international community can change its soft diplomacy towards Azerbaijan, because apparently it failed, and start applying a really tough language and start applying some sanctions and decreasing cooperation with Azerbaijan. And in that case, maybe Azerbaijan would also understand that it needs to save its international reputation, because as of now, Azerbaijan is still trying to whitewash its ethnic cleansing, saying that Armenians have departed voluntarily, which is, of course, ridiculous, because as I saw, Azerbaijan implemented 80% of Srebrenica scenario using all those same methods, and even the starvation, reminding Holodomor in Ukraine.
Weaponizing hunger. Mrs. Thatikian, let's come back to Armenia. Armenia recognized Nagorno-Karabakh as part of Azerbaijan in the hope that it would prevent Baku from making territorial claims on Armenia. Is this what we see happening?
There are two aspects in this question. The first one, as I already mentioned, when Armenia lowered the bar of the status of Nagorno-Karabakh, international community had to appreciate it and instead ensure international peacekeeping presence and autonomous status, making a pressure on Azerbaijan, which it did not. And perhaps Armenia had to be more assertive and demand those things, because human rights and security, yes, it included those things like autonomy, and it could include possibly those things, but it was very vague and it wasn't explicit, so it was kind of lost in translation. The second aspect is that, yes, there are two schools of thought. One thinks that since now there is no issue of Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan should automatically stop making any territorial claims to Armenia, because it was trying to make kind of mirroring claims, even if those mirroring was also false, because there was no any equivalent between Nagorno-Karabakh, people who lived there having their own self-governance for centuries, and any kind of claim that Azerbaijan could possibly make to Armenia. However, there is a second school of thought that actually this even speeded up Azerbaijan's further military advances towards sovereign Armenia. Now, we can of course argue which one is correct, but it's not about that. The point is that now, at least after the loss, very tragic loss of Nagorno-Karabakh, because Nagorno-Karabakh in the Armenian identity was part of our homeland. It was part of our identity. So this loss and part of our vital place, vital space. And you know, Armenians have been losing their vital space to live for centuries.
Back to the regulation process. Do you believe that Baku's intentions towards the borders of Armenia are peaceful?
Of course not, because Baku has been making, even after the loss of Nagorno-Karabakh, instead of at least trying to show that at least now it doesn't have further territorial and other kinds of claims to Armenia, it has been making very inconsistent and controversial statements. And even if sometimes Azerbaijani authorities are claiming that they have no territorial claims, next day they say something opposite. They demand enclaves, or they talk about Zangezur corridor, so-called Zangezur corridor, or they talk about return of Azerbaijanis to Zangezur, or they use those governmental sponsored NGOs like Western Armenia and use this strategy of revisionism of history in order to make up new claims to Armenia. So of course it's not genuine, and you know, Azerbaijan has been conducting also a lawfare. So of course it says sometimes that we prove that military solution to the conflict exists, which is against the UN Charter, and it tries to convince the diplomatic community that Armenia should not be even able to restore its defense sector, and just common attempts of Armenia to restore its defense sector are labeled as militarization of Armenia by Azerbaijan, which is ridiculous if we take into account that Azerbaijan is incredibly militarized and it doesn't stop to arm, it doesn't stop to buy arms from Israel, Turkey, and other countries. And it basically has access to NATO technologies through Turkey and even Israel. But at the same time, it is trying to prove to the international community that if Armenia buys any weapons, it's militarization of Armenia, which is a violation of the UN Charter, because in the UN Charter, it clearly says that each country is not only has a right, but is obliged to be able to defend its territory and to defend its civilian population.
Armenia has been stepping up its game towards a closer collaboration with the West, despite a formal alliance with CSTO. What realistic assistance should Armenia expect in case Azerbaijan does resort to aggression?
France became a pioneer of providing military cooperation to Armenia and expressing willingness to supply a certain amount of weapons and armaments and equipment, all for defensive purposes. However, France should not remain the only country. We have a bad experience to become dependent on one country, Russia, for our defense and security, and this mistake should never be repeated. We should diversify our defense and security partnerships, and we should also reapply to receive assistance from European Peace Facility, and I can list a lot of arguments, which I already listed actually, why European Union should provide us the same nature of military support to us as it has been providing to Moldova or Georgia. Ukraine is a separate case because Ukraine receives lethal weapons, but at least non-lethal military assistance should be provided by the European Union, and why not also the United States?
Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Expert in international relations and security, Sossi Թաթիկյան sat down with the Public TV tonight.